House Judiciary Committee had a hearing on what you could do to go and stop mass public shootings. It's pretty much any type of gun control regulation that you can think of, they were trying to push at that time. The main point of the testimony for the other witnesses was to go and describe the horrors of a mass murder. And the point of my testimony was say, yeah, it's pretty horrible, but let's try to do something that actually works. The types of things that they were pushing, like background checks on the private transfers of guns, there was no mention at all of any of the problems with it, and no mention at all that there's not one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped if such a law had been in effect and perfectly enforced. So I was trying to bring in a little bit of reality, I guess, into the discussions that were there, because I guess I've come to believe that a lot of these types of regulations are just being pushed because it's their way of making it costly or difficult for law-abiding people to be able to go and own guns for protection.
Right. Well, and it seems like many times the arguments from the other side of the fence are mostly emotionally driven. We must do something is the answer, right? Even if the things that they're doing, or as you said, the laws or regulations that they're suggesting would have absolutely zero effect on any of the mass shootings that have happened recently. I mean, we've talked about things like waiting periods, background checks, and everything else. And for most of these things, they would have made absolutely no difference and no change because the criminals either stole the guns or they had already owned them or they purchased them legally and they went through a background check. And again, all these other things about magazine sizes and I mean, all of this stuff seems to be irrelevant. It just seems like it's the effective theater of doing something.
Right. Well, I mean, I
So,
want to do something. I want to do something to stop these attacks, but I want to do something that's actually helpful. My concern is that while many of these things may have no effect, some of them actually have a pernicious effect. Uh, so we just had a couple mass public shootings in California, which have gotten huge
right.
national news attention. Obviously, if you look at a lot of the gun control groups, what they put out, California has, is has the most gun control laws of any state in the country. The different organizations give them an A, the only one with a perfect A in terms of their gun control laws. Um, I look at it and I see that the laws that they push all the time, like the assault weapons ban and what have you, weren't very helpful there. But what I also look at is the laws that they have that make it very difficult to stop those types of attacks. So, for example, in San Mateo County in Northern California, where Half Moon Bay is, they have 24 concealed handgun permit holders in the state, in the county. That is the equivalent of one permit holder for every 24,500 people. In Los Angeles County, they have one permit holder for every 5,500 adults. Uh, in the rest of the country, if you look at the 43 states that had right to carry laws, they have one permit holder for every 9 people. Well, that makes a huge difference. What are the odds that you're going to run into somebody who's going to be able to go and defend themselves when you're in California there? It's very, very, very low. Hopefully the Bruin decision that came down last year from the Supreme Court will force them to kind of loosen up their rules some. But I'm sure they're going to fight it every step of the way. I mean, just look at how costly it is to get a permit in California. Look at the types of rules that they're passing in New Jersey and New York. So, you try to point out that a lot of these laws actually accomplish the opposite of what they like to do. The problem is, whether you're talking about President Biden or Governor Newsom or the Democratic senators from California, their response is, We need even more gun control laws. We need even stricter rules. We need to go and ban even more guns that are there. So the handgun that was used in Monterey Park, um, people are making a big deal that it may be a MAC-10. There's another version of the gun it could possibly be, and but it may look scary, but it is a semi-automatic handgun. Over 85% of the handguns sold in the United States are semi-automatic handguns. Um, that means it's one pull the trigger, one bullet comes out, fires this 9 millimeter bullets, which is very common caliber, and the notion that somehow this is unique in terms of, they'll go and they say, well, it had a large capacity magazine. Well, any semi-automatic gun that can hold a magazine, detachable magazine, can hold a magazine of any size. So that's virtually all the semi-automatic handguns that are out there.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's kind of the lack of information that they have in making these discussions.
Well, you think they would you think that their eyes would be opened about certain things, and of course, it's not always correlation or causation. But when you look at it, and 1 in 5,500 people in Los Angeles is a concealed carry permit holder, or the 1 in 27,000 in the county you were talking about, versus 1 in 9, 1 in 12 people. And of course, when that was first proposed to have all these concealed carry permits across these countries, we kept hearing about how these cities and these states would, fall into a bloody war of, it'd be shootout at the OK Corral but it doesn't turn out that way.
No,
And yet, the cities, Chicago and Los Angeles and things like that, they just don't seem to get that memo that, that an armed citizen is not necessarily a bad thing.
well, they have to have a boogeyman to go and blame for the problems that they create. I mean, California has their bail reform. You've cut the prison terms for criminals who commit crimes. You have district attorneys who are refusing to prosecute violent criminals. You have that across much of the country. It's not a mystery why violent crime has increased after you've done that. You made it so it's not risky for criminals to go and commit crimes. But it's that same mindset that doesn't seem to understand the connection between whether it's risky for a criminal to commit a crime and the amount of crime that they commit with their attitude towards private ownership of guns. Just so you can make it risky for criminals to commit crimes with higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences, the death penalty. You can also make it risky for criminals to commit crime by allowing individuals to be able to go and defend themselves. But for some reason, the basic notion that if something's more costly, people do less of it, is something that they don't seem to understand at all. And partly, I guess it's the media. You have the constant barrage of bad things that happen with guns. The national media just ignores any defensive gun uses that occur. The year before last, we did a deep dive on media coverage in the United States on defensive gun uses and gun crimes. If you look at the 5 largest newspapers in the United States, the USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, between those 5 papers, they had a total of 10 defensive gun use stories. Most of those stories had something go wrong. The person shot the wrong person. The gun was taken away from them. They got in the way of the police. Something bad happened. By contrast, they had 1,700 news stories about gun crimes where somebody was either killed or wounded. They had over 2,700 news stories about gun crimes generally. So if you add in CNN and MSNBC, they had 0 defensive gun use stories over that year. You can consider yourself to be a very well-read person who follows the news very carefully, who reads the major news outlets, who watches CNN and MSNBC religiously. And you would come away with the fact that there's lots and lots of gun crimes that occur, and that there are really no defensive gun uses. And the couple times that there are defensive gun uses, something goes wrong. And it's just not the news. We just did a report on media coverage in entertainment television on cop shows. And
Right.
you can go and look at the last 20 years. You will search virtually in vain to find any defensive gun uses that are successful on entertainment television. The only ones that I know of are 2 episodes of Paramount's Yellowstone. All the other ones, something goes wrong. Either the person shoots the wrong person, or the gun's taken away from them and used against them, or something goes wrong. And it's gone into kind of hyper gear with regard to concealed handgun permit holders this current season. And I think that's because of the Bruin decision. It's very clear that the gun control groups work closely with producers and writers on these TV shows, and they want to go and show that whenever somebody uses a gun defensively, something goes wrong. And I think it makes a real impact on people's perceptions when you have millions of people watching these shows, and every single time that they're watching it, something goes wrong.
Yeah, I think we've seen that. Dr. John Lott is our guest. We've talked about that in the past. I mean, when the president of NBC, this is 15 years ago, but he blatantly came out and said, we're going to tell stories that reinforce this idea of why gun control matters. That's when you knew that this whole thing was being used as a narrative to try and train and control people. I mean, defensive gun use in this country, even the most conservative estimates were, I think it was at the Harvard School, I think, that said 90,000 defensive gun uses a year, and some studies.
National Crime Victimization Survey.
Yeah.
So here's the deal on that. So there's basically 2 different types of surveys. There's the National Crime Victimization Survey done by the Department of Justice, and then you have a lot of different types of academic and privately done surveys. The National Crime Victimization Survey shows about 100,000 or so defensive gun uses a year. The other surveys show on average about 2 million times a year. But there's a very simple explanation for the difference between the two, and that has to do with what screening questions are used. In the National Crime Victimization Survey, you're first asked whether you've been a victim of violent crime. And only once you say you've been a victim do they go and they ask you any questions that might indicate whether you used a gun defensively or not. In the other surveys, the screening question is, have you been threatened with you or somebody you've been with been threatened with a violent crime? And the difference is that if somebody uses a gun successfully, defensively, let's say they brandish a gun, and the would-be criminal runs away, which is the vast majority of defensive gun uses, you may not view yourself as having become a victim of a violent crime. And so you may say you haven't been a victim, and you never then get to talk or be asked any questions about whether you used a gun defensively.
Right. Well, and like you said, there's shades of gray in there, because most defensive gun uses, it seems like a shot is never fired. The mere presence of a firearm in the hands of a law-abiding citizen stops the crime. And so those are things that we don't get a chance to discuss. I want to talk a little bit more about your article about guns in Hollywood as well, because I think that is something that specifically infuriates a lot of people. But we've got to come back in just a moment. Dr. John Lott is our guest. We're going to continue with him here. Don't go anywhere. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. We return with Dr. John Lott. Nikki Gozer coming up in hour 2. And Willie Waffle. We will continue right here on your home for Common Sense Radio.
What is that?
Common Sense. Regularly heard on American radio. Michael Duke Show. Radio.
All right, we're in the break right now with Dr. John Lott, author of many books, and also the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. John, what else? What else are you working on right now? What's the latest and greatest that people should be watching for from Dr. John Lott right now? What's happening?
Well, we're updating our research on active shooting cases that are stopped by concealed carry permit holders. It's something we'll probably talk a little bit more about when we get back to the Hollywood bias on guns. But what I can say is one of the things that's been most amazing to me when I worked in Washington was how biased a lot of the government agencies seem to be in terms of, in terms of how they put out data and collect data. So one of the things that got a lot of attention last year was the claim by the FBI that only about 4% of so-called active shooting cases are stopped by citizens with permanent concealed handguns. An active shooting case is a gun that's fired in public where not involving some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight over drug turf. It could be anything from one person being targeted and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. When I worked at the Department of Justice up until January 2021, one of the tasks that I had was to go and look at those reports. And they're unbelievably badly done. They're missing all sorts of cases of people using guns defensively. So over the 8 years from 2014 to 2021, the FBI claims that there was only 11 defensive gun uses out of 252 cases. I think, and nobody needs to take my word because we have them on our website. We put them out there so people can check each case. I think there's 124 cases where people with permit concealed handguns have stopped attacks, and out of 360 active shooting cases. So basically the ones that they miss are ones where people use guns to stop attacks. And, so rather than 4%, I think it's 34%, but I didn't have the many millions of dollars to go and collect those cases. We literally did it on, a few $1,000s.
Right.
And what I will say is I'm more confident about the most recent data. And in 2021, for example, over 49% of the active shooting cases were stopped by citizens legally carrying a gun. Now, one argument that I had with the FBI people that I could make absolutely no progress with was whether you should separate out gun-free zones, places where civilians are banned from having guns, from other places. And my argument was, look, if you're talking about law-abiding citizens stopping these attacks, you can't expect them to stop attacks in places where it's illegal for them to go and have guns with them. And but the FBI wouldn't even begin to entertain that as something that should be considered. If you do that, rather than 49%, you find about 60% of the active shooting cases in 2021 were stopped by civilians legally carrying guns in places where they were allowed to do so. That's a lot different from 4%.
Yeah, is that a function, do you think, is that a function of the fact that more and more Americans are armed? When we talk about the crime, in the 70s and the 80s and how heavy it was and how we've been on this continually, downward slope on crime until, of course, 2020. But, I mean, the difference between 1970 and 2020 is that more Americans seem to be armed and have the ability to be armed than they did back then. So do you think that defensive gun use being upwards in the 60 percentile range is a function of more people being armed and trained?
Well, I don't know if it's gone up. I mean, I'm just saying we have a snapshot here, and the most accurate data that I have over the last 8 years is for the most recent years. I'm most confident about that. I can't tell you because nobody kept this type of data back in the 70s.
Right.
gun ownership may have been even higher back in the 70s or 60s or earlier than it is now. Um, for example, until 1969, even in New York City, all but one of the public high schools in the city had a shooting team.
Right.
You would literally have on any given school day, someplace between 8 and 10,000 high school students walking around in New York City carrying rifles. On subways, on buses, just on city streets. Uh, Obviously you don't see that now. Obviously they have much more restrictive gun control laws in places like California and New York than you used to.
All right, Dr. John Lott's our guest. We're getting ready to return. Let's jump back into it. Like and share, like and follow. Let's go. Here we go. Continuing now with Dr. John Lott from the Crime Prevention Research Center, author of the book Gun Control Myths, War on Guns, More Guns, Less Crime, and of course, a recognized national expert on firearms and statistics. You wrote an article, and you and I have talked about many times in the past, the hypocrisy that we see coming out of Hollywood and on the silver screen and on TV and streaming now of Hollywood on the one hand castigating and chastising people for wanting to be gun owners, and yet kind of glorifying this in their television programs and everything else. And you were just talking specifically about how the portrayal of gun owners or gun users in many of these things is as we either flub it or they're showing good guys with guns not doing the right thing or whatever. Give me a little background on this, and let's talk some more.
Right. Well, I'm not sure I agree completely that they glorify guns. What I think is they glorify law enforcement or military or somebody like that using guns, not
Right.
civilians using guns. And it's all pervasive that's there. You will constantly see news stories about something bad happening, not just news stories, but these entertainment shows. You can go to our website. We have a list of these types of cases there. And, you'll have the concealed carry permit holder shooting the wrong person or almost shooting the police or having the gun taken away from them or shooting a bystander accidentally. I think it has an impact on people's perceptions. That's the reason why they just constantly hit people over the head with this stuff on these TV shows. And hopefully, people will stop watching these things or they'll change them. But right now, it's kind of overwhelming. Look, a couple of years ago, we kept kind of track of all the guns used in crime by criminals on these TV entertainment cop shows. And about 85% of the guns that were used were machine guns. That's not reality. Since the late 1930s, there's been only one gun murder in the United States involving a machine gun. But you go and watch an episode of Magnum PI or something like that, and you would think that Hawaii on any given day has multiple more people killed with a machine gun than you've had in the entire United States since the late 1930s. And right now, the media is kind of going in hyperdrive about concealed carry permit holders, trying to show the danger that they have. There was just a show this week on CBS's FBI where a man trying to be a hero at a bank ends up getting shot and interfering with the police at the same time. Just last week, there was an episode on ABC's The Rookie, which had virtually the same plot. A police officer had urged this concealed carry permit holder not to get involved to stand down, that she was waiting for other officers to arrive at the scene so that they could go and properly handle the situation. The permit holder kind of refused to follow the officer's advice, got out there. He accidentally shot a bystander. He was purposely shot by the criminals. The criminals then were able to escape, and so the officer ends up telling other officers later on, a good guy with a gun, really screws things up as usual, and so it's something that you just see overwhelmingly on the news. Now, one thing I'll mention, we've done detailed reports on active shooting cases over the 8 years from 2014 to 2021. These are instances where guns fired in public, not part of some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight over drug turf. And it could be anything from one person being targeted and missed to all the way up to a mass public shooting. Over those 8 years, we find 124 instances where someone with a gun, with a concealed handgun permit, stopped what would have been an active shooting attack. But what I would point out is that there's not one of those instances where the permit holder accidentally shoots a bystander. There's not one of those instances where the permit holder gets in the way of police and prevents them from being able to properly go and do their job. There's none of those cases where a gun is taken away from the permit holder and used against them. So are those things possible? Yeah. But if you watch TV shows, police shows, you would think that that's what happens every single time that a permit holder uses their gun, when in fact it never happens.
So the statistics don't prove out what they're doing in the virtual fairy world, right?
It's the opposite.
Yeah. And that's, again, the most infuriating thing for most of us who have read your books, been following the statistics and everything else. Quite honestly, it's one of the reasons why I don't generally watch that kind of television, because it infuriates me when I see it, because I know that it is a blatant. I remember I was watching one show, the Kiefer Sutherland's Designated Survivor, and I watched the first 5 or 6 episodes. I thought, well, this show's pretty good. And then for like 3 episodes, they got into the gun control debate, and it was very obviously the entire thing was this anti-gun. They were using the whole show as an anti-gun platform, telling just outright lies and falsehoods on it, but people buy it hook, line, and sinker.
Right. No, I agree. In fact, we had episodes from that show up on our website to point out exactly the types of errors that you're talking about. Look, they work closely with gun control groups. The writers and producers for these shows do. They think that, you may have 4 to 7 million or more people watching different episodes that are there, and they think that they can gradually change the culture. If people constantly in the news hear about only bad things that happen with guns, and it's not just that. You have the government through the FBI, through the Centers for Disease Control. One of the things that came out recently was email exchanges between gun control groups like the Gun Violence Archive and the top people at the CDC, where the Gun Violence Archive people were saying you need to remove information on the number of defensive gun uses each year in the United States from your website, because they argued, the Gun Violence Archive guy argued, that it was making it more difficult for them to pass the types of gun control laws that they wanted to have. That's just a completely inappropriate argument for the CDC to be considering, whether or not data makes it harder or easier for gun control advocates like the Gun Violence Archive to go and pass those laws. The Gun Violence Archive, just as an aside, is someplace that's just constantly cited in the news. These claims about the number of mass shootings that occur over the course of a year, where it's like 1 a day or whatever. That's from the Gun Violence Archive people. They have their own definition that goes and makes it much higher than it would be using anybody else's definition. But on top of that, the vast majority, like 87% or so of the cases that they have are drug gangs fighting against each other over drug turf. I have no problem believing that that's a bad thing to happen. You don't want drug gangs fighting against each other over drug turf. The problem is, what happens is that they mix it in with these other types of mass public shootings, like the ones we just had in California, and
Right.
and they don't separate them out. The causes and solutions for stopping drug gangs fighting against each other over drug turf are very, very different than going and stopping a mass public shooting. But what they'll do is, in the news, and President Biden does this constantly, they'll go and they'll say, here we just had this case, this mass public shooting in California, and oh, by the way, there have been 31 of these so far this month. And that's, they want to go and say, and by the way, there have been drug gangs fighting against each other X number of times this month, and they've been killing other drug gang members. That would be different, but that's not the way it works.
That's not how they got it going on. Dr. John Lott, More Guns, Less Crime, Crime Prevention Research Center. Thank you so much for coming on board today and joining us. We appreciate you being part of it today.
Well, I appreciate you being there, Michael. People can find everything we're talking about at our website at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org.
We just went over the break there, so now we're into it. I give you any final thoughts for you today, Dr. Lott. We got a couple minutes here. I'll give you the Bill in the chat room said that's why it's called talking about television. That's why it's called programming, because it's trying to program you.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Well, right now, the interesting thing to me is how much people are pushing gun control around the country. I mean, you have California and Illinois and New York and New Jersey and Maryland, New Mexico, many states, Colorado, are pushing really strict, really bad gun control laws that are going to make it so that law-abiding citizens are going to find it much more difficult to be able to go and protect themselves and their families. There are lots of issues I can get into, but I think one of the big things about these gun control laws is how they disarm the very people who most likely need guns for self-defense. If my research convinces me of anything, there are two groups who benefit the most from owning guns. The people who are most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a male criminal doing the attack, and when a man is attacking a woman, there's a much larger strength difference that exists there on average than when a man is attacking another man. I mean, this is going to be relevant when you talk to Nikki Gozer in a minute or two, because, her work focuses on stalking type cases that are there.
Right.
And one of the shocking things to me is that when you read all the advice that women have been getting, is they're being told, change your name, quit your job, move in with relatives. If you go shopping, make sure you go shopping with a relative or a friend. They want them to completely alter their lives, lose jobs, and they're never told to be able to go and get a gun for protection, even though that's by far the safest course of action for them. But I'll let her go into all that stuff, because
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, but again, you're right. That's exactly what they're told. Basically, we as citizens are told, don't fight, just comply, roll over and wet on yourself, and just let them do whatever they want, and then the justice system will get justice for you later on. But in many cases, it could be not just your property or your body that they want. They may want your life.
right.
You've got to learn to fight, and a firearm is the greatest equalizer that we have for that. Dr. John Lott, thank you so much. As always, it's a pleasure to speak with you. I've just posted a link to your latest article in Real Clear Politics, which we didn't get a chance to jump on talking about the new safety stabilizer brace ruling and the disability and the veterans, which is another whole show, but we have talked about here recently. So we'll get you back on here, and we'll talk about it again in the future. Thank you for coming on board.
Oh, no, thank you. Again, people can find more at our website at crimeresearch.org. But always happy to talk to you. It's been too long since we've talked last, but take care.
We'll catch up with you here maybe next month. We'll catch up with you again. Thank you, Dr. Lott, for coming on board.
Thank you.
Dr. John Lott, Crime Prevention Research Center. Again, crimeresearch.org is where you find him. I see that Nikki Gozer is now here in the green room, and so let's bring her up to talk with us about this stuff as well. Good morning, Nikki. How are you doing?
Hi there. Good morning. I'm doing all right.
Well, thanks for coming on board and talking with us. I appreciate it. We're in the commercial break right now. We're going to rejoin the radio here in about 2 minutes, and so we will we'll get to you there. And I don't want to have you repeat everything twice. So if you want to hold on just a second, I'll be right back to you. We'll put you back in the green room, and we will be ready to go here right in the next couple minutes.
All right.
Okay, good. Nikki Gozer joins us here on the Michael Duke Show. All right, folks, I've linked Dr. Lott's latest article from Real Clear Politics in the chat room, and I'm about to drop Nikki's latest article on Fox News in the chat room as well. The title of her article from from last week is My Stalker Murdered My Husband, and Here's How You Can Protect Yourself. 78% of stalking victims take action to protect themselves, but experts ignore the right of self-defense.